5AA Summer Afternoons
with Richard Pascoe.
At 16 minutes past 1, thank you for joining me this afternoon. Jeff has sent text in to say that Bendigo Bank is back and working. Thanks for that, Jeff. My next guest. It's 50 years for Cyclone Tracy tomorrow. And Bill Cooper, good friend of mine. Good afternoon, Bill.
Good afternoon, Richard, and thank you for having me.
Oh, pleasure to have you. Now, you were in Darwin at the time at the airport. What was your position there?
Okay, well, I had a job basically which looked after the positioning of aircraft because there was a very restricted tarmac there. So it wasn't a terribly important job except for one night. But let's just set the scene here because there's a bit of preparedness for that one often wonders about when you think of cyclones. In the 2 or 3 weeks leading up to the cyclone, we had warnings about tropical cyclone Selma. And the alphabet goes from S to T.
Yeah.
So we had, you did all the right things. You taped up your windows. You filled your bath full of water. So, the sort of things one should prepare. And, we've got some additional rain, a bit of lightning, and it was windy, which basically is Darwin during the cyclone season. So I guess when it came to the warnings for tropical cyclone Tracy, people were maybe, hey, we had one of those 2 weeks ago. But Tracy did, in fact, come in. So I'd set off to my little job at the airport for the midnight shift, bright and early, because the guy I was replacing. Good on you, Bruno, if you're listening.
How old were you, Bill?
I was 25.
Yep. You don't look a day over it now. I'll just put that out there right now. But yeah.
Very kind of.
Thank you.
So we ended up at the... sending you home bright and early. I got a call from Air Traffic Control because the Department of Civil Aviation in those days ran the terminal facility, and because it's also a military aerodrome as well, all the tower stuff, all aircraft control is done by the military, by the RAF. So it's saying, well, you're going to have a nice quiet night. Which wasn't entirely accurate. What he meant was, of course, there would be no aircraft movements. And the thought at the time was that Cyclone Tracy was going to go past Darwin as Selma had done 2 or 3 weeks beforehand. About half an hour into the actual shift, just after midnight, I got a call saying, get out now, evacuation plan in order. So that was the idea. So suddenly I became the guy that was telling everybody else at the airport at the tender age of 25, all the airline staff, my own department staff, a couple of civilians, the guy that was on before me had put up in the VIP room as they weren't flying anywhere because nothing was flying in or flying out. So the evacuation plan called for us to go to the operations building, which was, I guess, 700-800 metres away, down the little road that led into the airport. But it was a very small strip of bitumen, just a car either side, and a lot of grass, and by then a massive amount of water running along the channels that took the copious rain that you get in the wet season in Darwin away. And my attempt to drive down there, I got not terribly far, but I said, heck with this, and backed the car up and literally parked it inside the terminal because Darwin had an open-faced terminal. So I parked in, and there was a bit of shaking going on from the two civilians who were with me and saying, well, that didn't work out the way you planned it. And I said, yep, that's fair comment. So parked the car inside the terminal. Turned out to be a good idea. The cars that were parked in the terminal car park weren't looking too pretty the next morning.
I bet they weren't. So
we gathered everybody together, and there was one room in the entire 2-storey airport that had no windows or to the outside, and that was the Qantas baggage hall.
Right.
What it did have was like a little conveyor belt of about 20-odd metres and some little flappy fingers at the far end, which gradually allowed enough water to get blown in that we ended up having to sit up on the benches as... one tends not to wear terribly waterproof footwear in those areas. Because it was still, very, very warm. So we sheltered there. The big saving grace, I think, and everybody says this that's been there in Darwin, is that it was dark and you couldn't see what's happening. You could see afterwards. You could see, some you could see impacts where fridges had literally been blown, 2, 3, 4, 5 metres in the air and hit stuff. But you couldn't see it, so that was the saving grace. But the salient moment, and probably the only time in my life I actually did something clever, was when the eye of the cyclone passed over. Now, one of my airport traffic officers, Dennis, if you're listening, his wife was in the caravan park, in a caravan, just a K away from where the airport was, and he was very, very keen to get out and see his wife. And I just said, Dennis, no, look, it's the eye of the cyclone, mate. He said, oh, it's not. No, I'm sure it's not. And he was, someone of your dimensions, and I'm about, 15, 20 centimetres shorter than that, and not to mention outweighed by Dennis. But we not that there was any suggestion in the workplace in those days, but gradually we just started, because there was this silence after all the banging
That
and
would be so
clattering.
eerie, wouldn't it?
It was incredibly eerie. And then we just started to hear a little psh, and then eventually, slowly, but it seemed, but very quickly in reality, that wind built up. And of course, because it's the eye of the cyclone, it came from the opposite direction.
So you're battered at one side, and now we've turned around to the other side.
Which, with the airport, which was pretty much, the airport building was pretty much destroyed during that and was never ever used again. But for a lot of people who are out there sheltering in houses, now suddenly, half their house has been destroyed and they're sheltering in a particular way. Now the wind comes from the other direction. So it was, that was a real shock to everybody, I think. But for once in my life, I was actually right about the eye of the cyclone. And, how at age 25 you can be so sure about that, I don't know. But I'm glad I didn't let Dennis go.
No, you're very good. And the two civilians, how were they at this time?
By this time, they'd gotten a bit quieter.
Right.
Or the young gentleman had realised that something really serious was going on. They were, as I say, they were a young couple. They were on their way to Bali, but their stuff got cancelled, and the guy before me kindly put them up in the VIP room. But eventually it all ended, and basically we all looked at each other and said, "What now?" I said, "Don't know about you guys, but I'm going home to see where my wife is." So drove home along the highway with.
Well, let's back up slightly. When you opened the doors to look outside.
Oh yeah.
Right, because, and I'm just assuming you would have gone outside first, being the man in charge.
Yeah.
For it. What was your initial reaction for all of this?
Well, we could see, when the eye of the cyclone passed over, we opened the doors and had a look out, and we could see the level of devastation that was there. A huge chunk of the entrance and exit doors, which were very large, had just blown off and was resting up against the central stairs there. Well, by the time we got to look at it after when it had all ended, that was now 2/3 of the way up the stairs. The wind had just walked this segment which must have weighed several tons, just walked it up the stairs, which is quite bizarre. But there was water everywhere. You could tell it was just devastated. Obviously, there was no power. Even the airport electrical systems were all down. In departmental terms, we had no communications, all towers, all aerials, all masts, everything just got blown flat.
When did people get in contact with the airport from outside?
Right. Well, that was a couple of days later. The operations centre, which was a single-storey structure, which was where we were supposed to get to if we could get to it, was up and running fairly quickly. Our guys got there with a diesel generating set, fired it up, connected it up to the switchboard, got the air conditioning going, because all the electronics were, there's not much solid-state stuff happening in those days, so drying it out and getting it going was a bit easier. But within about 24 hours, we had air conditioning running there, sufficient to actually get communications going. We had no tower, so guys were out throwing wires over the tops of trees, or very sparse-looking trees. If you've ever seen any of those photos, there's not a leaf to be seen anywhere. So it's just these spindly-looking trees, and throwing wires over to provide an aerial so that we could get communications.
Now, your wife Sandra?
Yep, she was home.
She was home.
How
was she during all of this?
She says she convinced herself it was just rubbish tin lids flying around. rather than large and rather deadly sheets of galvanised iron, obviously, as they got blown off and destroyed houses. When I got home, I got to the front door. I could see Sandra on the other side and she could see me because it had a glass panel in it, but couldn't open the front door because so much water had got blown under it that it had swollen up to the extent that it couldn't move, couldn't easily open it. So I had to turn the key in the lock and kick the door, which is a good thing I was 25 because I certainly couldn't perform that currently. But yes, basically had to kick the door and then we couldn't lock the door. It just bowed out to the extent that it wouldn't shut.
So when you look back on all of this and, you know, the people at the airport at the time, you've got to go back and say, look, I made all the right decisions on that day.
I think, if I'd known what I knew now, I probably wouldn't even attempted to try and drive to the operations building, even though that's what the evacuation plan called for. But yeah, everything worked out. I often say in jest that, nobody died on my watch there at the airport, so I'm calling it a win.
Yeah.
And that's very much the way I feel about it. Over the ensuing days, you drove out and tried to find friends. I had friends, the Clarks, Nigel and Margaret, who lived in the northern suburbs, and I've got photos of around their area where, you can't tell one house from the other. I've got a photo that I've taken, which I swear is of their place, and I know Margaret's looked at it and said, I don't think that's our house. And you just couldn't tell. It was just such devastation everywhere. There were no landmarks left that you would expect to see in a suburb,
It's such a vivid memory that must just live with you.
It is, and most of the time it's not something that you dwell on. And indeed, we've been back to Darwin 2 or 3 times, Sandra and I, and we went to the Cyclone Museum, and that was all fine. But there's one room where they sort of recreate the experience and the sound of the wind and so on. And I was in there not terribly long, and I thought, no, that's long enough.
Yeah.
The sound is something you never forget. Where we were fortunate. The building was structurally sound, and whilst the fact that every room in the place had an outdoor window which got smashed in some way, shape or form, and obviously got full of water, and because of that, where we were safe. Of course, there were hundreds and thousands of people whose homes, the roof went first, and then one room, then the next room, then the next room, then the next room, and end up sheltering in baths. One of our relations has had a bad back ever since because his caravan collapsed, and he took the weight of what remained of the roof on his back to protect his family from what happened. He's had a bit of a dodgy back ever since.
As you would expect. Bill, it's been absolutely fascinating talking to you. I mean, I see you at the pub every week, yes. For it. But, and I have heard the story before, but it's just, honestly, it's great of you to come in today and just share that story. I really appreciate it. I'm sure the listeners do.
Well, thank you for that, Richard. It's a lovely aspect here where there's looking out across Highway Square. There's not a breath of wind, which is always nice.
It's always nice on a day like today.
Yes.
Mate, have a good Christmas, all right? And I know I'll personally talk to you very, very soon. My best to all your family.
Thank you, Richard.
All right, we are going to go to news headlines right now.